Okay, so this our our final week's readings. Here we go. Good heavens, 8 weeks goes fast, doesn't it? So let's kind of walk through this a little bit. Most of the terms, obviously, we'll now be familiar with, so we can kind of go through it a little quicker. So again, always a good idea, read over the introduction, right? Which gives you a sense of where we're going. And then what I always like to do, introduction and look at subtitles. Okay, so revisiting ethical issues, right? Addressing global ethical dissensus from a rationalist perspective. So obviously we're talking rationalist ideas. And then beyond rationalism, still addressing global ethical dissensus beyond ration. And then his conclusion, right? So what is this article going to be about? Just looking at that stuff? Well, we're going to assess rationalist stuff. And since we're going beyond it, we're going to assume that it's not going to be perfect. So anyway, intro. All attempts to address questions in global ethics are confronted with the challenge of how to respond to this lack of consensus. Obviously, right? We've now done all these projects, you've done all these readings and stuff. I don't think we have to spend a whole lot of time in making the case that different cultures have different ethical perspectives, right? That's all there is to it. And we looked at those frameworks of Western, Eastern, Indigenous, right? So good enough. As we will see, what counts as ethically appropriate means depends on assumptions different perspectives hold about the authoritative status of their moral claims. This, I think, is an important idea, and one that maybe this course might get you to start thinking about. And that is ultimately the authoritative status of our claims, right? As an example, in the was it 6-2 where we were arguing? Oh man, one of the papers that we did was about, oh yeah, it was the last one, 6-2, whether it's morally justified to, remember you had two things you could choose from for a religion to do anything that it needed to do to survive versus to intervene in a authoritarian regime that was doing inhumane things, kind of thing. And anyway, so as I'm grading these, it's like most people were of the opinion that, yeah, you can go in and we should be able to stand up for our country and our rights and all that kind of stuff. And this is exactly what we're talking about by the authoritative status of our moral claims. Because it's one thing to have a sense of, oh yes, we should be able to do X. And another thing to do X, right? So considering that we have different, moral outlooks. So you take something like Vladimir Putin and the war in Ukraine, right? We could look at that and say, hey, there's an attempt at aggression from a dictator who's not too concerned with human rights. And we might be able to say, hey, what he's doing is immoral, unethical. But then we're not stopping them though either, right? So in other words, what's the authority above that conflict to which we can both agree and come to some sort of resolution, right? That's the problem in all of this stuff. It's about where do you find the authority to actually arbitrate these things to a satisfactory decision, right? Global. He brings up this term global, is a term that's been coined to capture the ways in which globalization processes are not uniform, but are always locally experienced and transformed by, as well as transformative of, local contexts. So in the other article that you're going to be doing for this week, the authors talk about sort of like the history of globalization as part of it. And it's true, we have been, as a race, becoming more globally linked, right? You could even talk in the ancient period with, empires, building empires. An empire is an attempt at like a small piece of globalization. But we have been becoming more interlinked. And so it's in the global where we see the global issues coming to head and really becoming an issue, a thorny issue in the local politics, which is, all about the global. It's just like, how so many world wars are started by alliance systems, right? World War I with Archduke Ferdinand. It's like you have one little domino here, but because there's empires involved up here, one local little issue brings all the big boys in. It's that kind of thing. Anyway, so let's talk about revisiting the ethical issues. And again, right, I'm just pointing out some key facts of the logic in this article. Read it for yourself, of course, right? But here he says, we may have established in principle that the polluter should pay, but who's the polluter? Is it states, corporations, citizens, those polluting now, or the heirs of those who polluted in the past, right? And so this, he's saying, it's one of the issues of global ethics, going back to what we just read about here, about where's the authority, right? Like we all agree, of course, climate change is bad and pollution is bad. Sweet. But now how do we figure out who's to blame and how to fix it, right? Once this debate is globalized across different types of political community, each with its own complex form of moral traditions, then disagreement over the why question also becomes disagreement over what ethical values count as genuinely global, right? So we still have this difficulty of thinking in global terms, right? Just logically, right? Just ethically, in theory. But then we also have, moral traditions that people actually live in these various places, right? And so, again, it's doubly difficult to try to come up with, what is globally ethical. Implicit in all these debates and their implications for ethical judgment and action is the stake of moral authority, implicit in different answers to the questions. So we're going to talk about rationalists, utilitarians, deontologists, and we've come across these before, so I didn't define the terms this time. The question of how to convince others of the validity of a particular ethical position is central to modern philosophical ethics. And really, folks, this is where it all comes down to, what it comes down to, right? Is, okay, it's about convincing people that this is the right action with a tremendous urgency, right? Think about, for instance, environmental ethics and stuff, right? But that's the whole shtick. Validity, which of course goes hand in hand with authority. And so I'm not going to go through all of these things, but he talks about discourse ethics, and each one of these things, it's sort of like a pro and con, right? So it says, well, it's good in this regard, but it doesn't help us there. So addressing the global ethical dissensus. I forgot where that came up here in the intro. Dissensus means like we can't come to a consensus. If anything, we are moving away from it. That's what dissensus means. So a rationalist perspective, if you recall, rationalists are those who believe that, well, as it applies to ethics, that the right course is one that is not completely devoid of experience and tradition, that kind of stuff, but does its best to transcend it, right? So think of the rationalist perspective as trying to be as mathematical as possible and sort of minimize the historical, the traditional, the embodied, the emotional, that kind of stuff. So anyways, this means we do not have a pre-existing map of the shape and potential outcomes of global moral disputes in the way we do of moral judgments that are closer to home. So in other words, what he's saying is, yeah, it's going to be very difficult because we can't just ignore our traditions, what we grew up with, our cultures, that kind of stuff. One therefore needs to exercise some care in identifying ethical disagreements and not to jump to the conclusion that because practices in different contexts are different, this implies the inhabituation of distinct moral universes. So what is he saying there? We can't give up, I guess, is what it boils down to, right? Yes, we're going to have these different moral things, and some people's cultures will make them disagree with a certain moral position. But then we can't just give up and say, well, then therefore it's all arbitrary. Okay, so here's what he's saying about how the utilitarian perspective kind of works. And we're talking about female genital mutilation here. And the idea is, most people would concur that that's wrong from a rational perspective. But then when he begins to apply this, it's like, yeah, but then ultimately you get into this problem of, the culture. So some people who believe in female genital mutilation will say, how dare you tell us how to run our culture, because the world is a diverse cultural place, right? So you've got this problem between what is morally good in terms of universal rational principles versus diversity and sovereignty, right? Then we talk about contractualist moral theory, how it works, pros and cons, deontological moral theory, etc. And I skipped all this over, but it's interesting to watch, to read, right, about how these different theories are both effective and not effective. At the end of the day, there's not any one that's going to ultimately help us too terribly much, which is why he goes here by saying, there's several points to note about the ethics of tackling ethical dissensus in the perspectives discussed. The first point is that all the perspectives put limits on live and let live approach to global clashes of value, right? So the idea that we should respect all of the diverse opinions can't happen, right? In global ethics, it can't happen. At some point, we're going to have to tell somebody that they can't do something. That's what we're saying. Second, all the perspectives claim to be detached from anchorage in any particular majority view. Okay, so in other words, they are rationalists. Are saying, no, we're floating above. We're detached from any particularity. We're being universal, which means opinions contrary to moral truth are categorized as opinion and therefore inferior. So if we're going to be rationalist and we're going to say, okay, we've got an ethical universal system or perspective that rises above any petty local stuff, then what that means is if you disagree, then your opinion is basically wrong and inferior, right? Which is going to make it very difficult to reach consensus. And a little bit more on that. And then he brings up discourse ethics as one possible, way out. And discourse ethics, if you recall, from a guy named Habermas that kind of originated, maintains that, well, don't come in with theories. Just come in with equal players in a fair and equal discussion, and they'll figure it out. But the problem is, equal and fair were still there, right? Because if you're going to say that, should we eat babies, and there's a group of people who steal babies and eat them from people, and we're going to say, okay, well, we're all fair and equal, so baby eaters come to the table and we'll talk as equals. People will be like, well, no, I mean, they stole my baby and ate it, so how is that equal, right? So you get into all that stuff. So then, beyond rationalism, he highlights the work of Ben Habib and kind of explains that Ben Habib moves on to question again the over-rationalism of Habermas with its assumption of disembodied rational participants. In place of this vision, Ben Habib argues for understanding of the moral point of view as involving seeing from each other's point of view in a double sense. not only operating according to assumptions of universal respect and equality in relation to the others involved, but also using one's imagination and empathy. And so therefore we bring in virtue ethics, feminist ethics, which are more about the situatedness of the person, more about the empathy and emotion. And maybe this is a solution where the rationalist ones couldn't solve the problem. And then we bring in Walzer. If you recall, we looked at this guy a couple weeks ago. Precisely because virtue ethics is contextual, virtue theorists cannot simply assert the integrity of one way of life over another. And then it's too slow, etc. So one of the problems with virtue ethics and stuff is you're talking about flourishing, right? But there's no tool to say that one flourishing is better than the other, which means therefore you can't have any moral authority to actually make any change. And then we talk about feminist ethic and postmodernism. If you recall, postmodernism was all about trying to avoid, sort of politically generated senses of what is correct and normal. The problem with postmodernism is that any discussion that tries to become equal will always ultimately end up being a political discussion about, why is it that this person is given priority over that person? And so at the end of it, none of these perspectives is 100%, right? So we read all of this and we get to the conclusion and we're like, good heavens, like, how are we going to find any way to build consensus? For this reason, even if one is confident of one's ethical position in the abstract, that confidence is hard to translate to a consistent set of behaviors in our personal lives, let alone to the behaviors of collective actors such as states, organizations, and charities. And then here it all culminates right here to this particular 2 sentences at the very last of the chapter. At the same time, the resources provided by these theories, i.e. the ones we've been talking about, for making connections between strangers tend to reinforce rather than challenge moral exclusion because of the way in which they set up the relation between the experts in global ethics and those who are to benefit from this expertise, right? So it's almost like a doctor-patient kind of relation, right? And it's like when we're trying to solve these problems, it's like here are some people who need assistance and here are the assistance givers. So it's never going to be equal, right? In this respect, we also need to learn from theorists such as Apaya and Parekh, who argue that global ethics is as much about invention as it is about discovery. And that thinking about the ethical who and how questions involved in this process of invention as well as discovery is ultimately what makes the field of global ethics especially distinctive and challenging. And so what do we get at the end of it? What's the answer? Alas, there isn't one. And so what we get here right by the end of this chapter is a good understanding of, again, how complicated it will be to try to solve these problems, right? And so we leave this text with the understanding that it's about it's about invention, right? So we need to discover things, i.e., some sort of system of consensus, some sort of system of ethics that can work for all people in the world to get on board and discuss. But we're going to have to invent that. And really, it's sort of like trying to build a ship at sea, what we're doing here. We're trying to establish workable, global, ethical frameworks while we don't have global perspectives, right? And so that's the tremendous challenge. Anyway, that's what that article is all about.